Chapter 22 of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Trial. In a few moments more the storm had passed completely. Only the wet city streets, the mist over the lake, and the moist warmth of the air remained. For some time the three visitors to this extraordinary world stood silent at the latticed windows, awed by what they had seen. The noise of the panels as the chemist slid them back brought them to themselves. "A curious land, gentlemen," he remarked quietly. It's weird," the Very Young Man ejaculated. The Chemist led them out across the roof to its other side facing the city. The street upon which the house stood sloped upward over the hill behind. It was wet with the rain and gleamed like a sheet of burnished silver, and down its sides now ran two little streams of liquid silver fire. The street, deserted during the storm, was beginning to fill again with people returning to their tasks. At the intersection with the next road above, they could see a line of sleighs passing. Beneath them, before the wall of the garden, a little group of men stood talking. On a rooftop near by, a woman appeared with a tiny naked infant, which she sat down to nurse in the corner of her garden. "The city at work," said the Chemist with a wave of his hand. "Shall we go down and see it?" His three friends assented readily, the Very Young Man suggesting promptly that they first visit Lylda's father and Aura. "He is teaching Loto this morning," said the Chemist, smiling. "Why not go to the court?" suggested the Big Business Man. "Is the public admitted?" asked the Doctor. "Nothing is secret here," the Chemist answered. "By all means. We will go to the court first, if you wish. Lylda should be through very shortly." The court of Arite stood about a mile away near the lake shore. As they left the house and passed through the city streets, the respect accorded the Chemist became increasingly apparent. The three strangers with him attracted considerable attention, for although they wore the conventional robes in which the more prominent citizens were generally attired, their short hair and pallid whiteness of their skins made them objects of curiosity. No crowd gathered. Those they passed stared a little, raised their hands to their foreheads, and went their way. Yet, underneath these signs of respect, there was with some an air of sullenness, of hostility, that the visitors could not fail to notice. The Oroid men in street garb were dressed generally in a short metallic-looking tunic of drab, with a brighter colored girdle. The women, most of them, wore only a sort of skirt reaching from the waist to knees. A few had circular discs covering their breasts. There were hardly any children to be seen, except occasionally a little face staring at them from a window or peering down from a rooftop. Once or twice they passed a woman with an infant slung across her back in a sort of hammock. The most common vehicle was the curious form of sleigh in which they had ridden down through the tunnels. They also saw a few little two-wheeled carts with wheels that appeared to be of a solid segment of tree trunk. All the vehicles were drawn by meek-looking little gray animals, like a small deer without horns. The courthouse of Arite, though a larger building, from the outside was hardly different than most others in this city. It was distinct, however, in having on either side of the broad doorway that served as its main entrance a large square stone column. As they entered, passing a guard who saluted them respectfully, the visitors turned from a hallway and ascended a flight of steps. At the top they found themselves on a balcony overlooking the one large room that occupied almost the entire building. The balcony ran around all three sides. The room was triangular in shape and was railed with a low stone parapet. On it were perhaps 50 people, sitting quietly on stone benches that lay close up behind the parapet. An attendant stood at each of the corners of the balcony. The one nearest bowed low as the Chemist and his companions entered silently and took their seats. From the balcony the entire room below was in plain view. At the apex of its triangle sat the judge on a raised dais of white stone with a golden canopy over it. He was a man about 50, this leader of the court, garbed in a long loose robe of white. His hair that fell on his shoulders was snowy white, and around his forehead was a narrow white band. He held in his hand a sort of scepter of gold with a heavy golden triangle at its end. In 6 raised tiers of unequal length, like a triangular flight of stairs, across the angle of the room and directly in front of the judge was the jury, 20 men and 20 women, seated in alternate rows. The men wore loose robes of gray, the women robes of blue. On a seat raised slightly above the others sat a man who evidently was speaker for the men of the jury. On a similar elevated seat was the woman speaker. This latter was Lylda. Near the center of the room, facing the judge and jury, were 2 triangular spaces about 20 feet across, enclosed with a breast-high wall of stone. Within each of these enclosures were perhaps 10 or 12 people seated on small stone benches. Directly facing the members of the jury and between them and the 2 enclosures was a small platform raised about 4 feet above the floor, with several steps leading up to it from behind. A number of attendants dressed in the characteristic short tunics, with breastplates and a short sword hanging from their waist, stood near the enclosures and along the sides of the room. The Chemist leaned over and whispered to his friends, "Those 2 enclosed places in the center are for the witnesses. Over there are those testifying for the accused. The others are witnesses for the government. The platform is where the accused stands when—" He broke off suddenly. An expectant hush seemed to run over the room. A door at the side opened, and preceded and followed by 2 attendants a man entered, who walked slowly across the floor and stood alone upon the raised platform facing the jury. He was a man of extraordinarily striking look and demeanor. He stood considerably over 6 feet in height, with a remarkably powerful yet lean body. He was naked except for a cloth breech-clout girdled about his loins. His appearance was not that of an Oroid, for beside his greater height and more muscular physique, his skin was distinctly of a more brownish hue. His hair was cut at the base of the neck in Oroid fashion. It was black, with streaks of silver running through it. His features were large and cast in a rugged mold. His mouth was cruel, and wore now a sardonic smile. He stood erect, with head thrown back and arms folded across his breast, calmly facing the men and women who were to judge him. The Very Young Man gripped the Chemist by the arm. "Who is that?" he whispered. The Chemist's lips were pressed together. He seemed deeply affected. "I did not know they caught him," he answered softly. "It must have been just this morning." The Very Young Man looked at Lylda. Her face was placid, but her breast was rising and falling more rapidly than normal, and her hands in her lap were tightly clenched. The judge began speaking quietly, amid a deathlike silence. For over 5 minutes he spoke. Once he was interrupted by a cheer, instantly stifled, and once by a murmur of dissent from several spectators on the balcony that called forth instant rebuke from the attendant stationed there. The judge finished his speech and raised his golden scepter slowly before him. As his voice died away, Lylda rose to her feet, and facing the judge, bowed low, with hands to her forehead. Then she spoke a few words, evidently addressing the women before her. Each of them raised her hands and answered in a monosyllable, as though affirming an oath. This performance was repeated by the men. The accused still stood silent, smiling sardonically. Suddenly his voice rasped out with a short, ugly intonation, and he threw his arms straight out before him. A murmur rose from the spectators, and several attendants leaned forward towards the platform, but the man only looked around at them contemptuously and again folded his arms. From one of the enclosures a woman came and mounted the platform beside the man. The Chemist whispered, "His wife. She is going to speak for him." But with a muttered exclamation and a wave of his arms, the man swept her back, and without a word she descended the steps and re-entered the railed enclosure. Then the man turned and raising his arms spoke angrily to those seated in the enclosure. Then he appealed to the judge. The Chemist whispered in explanation, "He refuses any witnesses." At a sign from the judge the enclosure was opened, and its occupants left the floor, most of them taking seats upon the balcony. "Who is he?" the Very Young Man wanted to know, but the Chemist ignored his question. For perhaps 10 minutes the man spoke, obviously in his own defense. His voice was deep and powerful, yet he spoke now seemingly without anger, and without an air of pleading. In fact, his whole attitude seemed one of irony and defiance. Abruptly he stopped speaking, and silence again fell over the room. A man and a woman left the other enclosure and mounted the platform beside the accused. They seemed very small and fragile as he towered over them, looking down at them sneeringly. The man and woman conferred a moment in whispers. Then the woman spoke. She talked only a few minutes, interrupted twice by the judge, once by a question from Lylda, and once by the accused himself. Then for perhaps 10 minutes more her companion addressed the court. He was a man considerably over middle age, and evidently, from his dress and bearing, a man of prominence in the nation. At one point in his speech it became obvious that his meaning was not clearly understood by the jury. Several of the women whispered together, and one rose and spoke to Lylda. She interrupted the witness with a quiet question. Later the accused himself questioned the speaker until silenced by the judge. Following this witness came 2 others. Then the judge rose, and looking up to the balcony where the Chemist and his companions were sitting, motioned to the Chemist to descend to the floor below. The Very Young Man tried once again with his whispered question, "What is it?" But the Chemist only smiled, and rising quietly left them. There was a stir in the courtroom as the Chemist crossed the main floor. He did not ascend the platform with the prisoner, but stood beside it. He spoke to the jury quietly, yet with a suppressed power in his voice that must have been convincing. He spoke only a moment, more with the impartial attitude of one who gives advice than as a witness. When he finished he bowed to the court and left the floor, returning at once to his friends upon the balcony. Following the Chemist, after a moment of silence, the judge briefly addressed the prisoner, who stolidly maintained his attitude of ironic defiance. "He's going to ask the jury to give its verdict now," said the Chemist in a low voice. Lylda and her companion leader rose and faced their subordinates, and with a verbal monosyllable from each member of the jury, the verdict was unhesitatingly given. As the last juryman's voice died away, there came a cry from the back of the room. A woman tore herself loose from the attendants holding her, and running swiftly across the room, leaped upon the platform. She was a slight little woman, almost a child in appearance beside the man's gigantic stature. She stood looking at him a moment with heaving breast and great sorrowful eyes, from which the tears were welling out and flowing down her cheeks unheeded. The man's face softened. He put his hands gently upon the sides of her neck. Then, as she began sobbing, he folded her in his great arms. For an instant she clung to him. Then he pushed her away. Still crying softly, she descended from the platform and walked slowly back across the room. Hardly had she disappeared when there arose from the street outside a faint, confused murmur as of an angry crowd gathering. The judge had left his seat now, and the jury was filing out of the room. The Chemist turned to his friends. "Shall we go?" he asked. "This trial," began the Big Business Man. "You haven't told us its significance. This man, good God, what a figure of power and hate and evil! Who is he?" "It must have been evident to you, gentlemen," the Chemist said quietly, "that you have been witnessing an event of the utmost importance to us all. I have to tell you of the crisis facing us. This trial is its latest development. That man—" The insistent murmur from the street grew louder. Shouts arose, and then a loud pounding from the side of the building. The Chemist broke off abruptly and rose to his feet. "Come outside," he said. They followed him through a doorway onto a balcony overlooking the street. Gathered before the courthouse was a crowd of several hundred men and women. They surged up against its entrance angrily, and were held in check there by the armed attendants on guard. A smaller crowd was pounding violently upon a side door of the building. Several people ran shouting down the street, spreading the excitement through the city. The Chemist and his companions stood in the doorway of the balcony an instant, silently regarding this ominous scene. The Chemist was just about to step forward when, upon another balcony near the corner of the building, a woman appeared. She stepped close to the edge of the parapet and raised her arms commandingly. It was Lylda. She had laid aside her court robe and stood now in her glistening silver tunic. Her hair was uncoiled and fell in dark masses over her white shoulders, blowing out behind her in the wind. The crowd hesitated at the sight of her and quieted a little. She stood rigid as a statue for a moment, holding her arms outstretched. Then, dropping them with a gesture of appeal, she began to speak. At the sound of her voice, clear and vibrant, yet soft, gentle, and womanly, there came silence from below, and after a moment every face was upturned to hers. Gradually her voice rose in pitch. Its gentle tone was gone now. It became forceful, commanding. Then again she flung out her arms with a dramatic gesture and stood rigid, every line of her body denoting power, almost imperious command. Abruptly she ceased speaking, and as she stood motionless, slowly at first, the crowd silently dispersed. The street below was soon clear. Even those onlookers at a distance turned the corner and disappeared. Another moment passed, and then Lylda swayed and sank upon the floor of the balcony, with her head on her arms against its low stone railing, just a tired, gentle, frightened little woman. "She did it. How wonderfully she did it!" the Very Young Man murmured in admiration. "We can handle them now," answered the Chemist, "but each time it is harder. Let us get Lylda and go home, gentlemen. I want to tell you all about it." He turned to leave the balcony. "Who was that man? What was he tried for?" the Very Young Man demanded. "That trial was the first of its kind ever held," the Chemist answered. "The man was condemned to death. It was a new crime, the gravest we have ever had to face, the crime of treason." End of chapter 22. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lylda's Plan. Back home, comfortably seated upon the broad balcony overlooking the lake, the three men sat waiting to hear their host's explanation of the strange events they had witnessed. Lylda busied herself preparing a light noonday meal, which she served charmingly on the balcony while they talked. "My friends," the Chemist began, "I tried to give you this morning a picture of this world and the life I have been leading here. I think you understand, although I did not specifically say so, that all I said related to the time when I first came here. That you would call this life Utopia because of the way I outlined it, I do not doubt, or at least you would call it a state of affairs as near utopian as any human beings can approach. All that is true. It was Utopia. But, gentlemen, it is so no longer. Things have been changing of recent years, until now, well, you saw what happened this morning. I cannot account for the first cause of this trouble. Perhaps the Malite war, with its disillusionment to our people. I do not know. Faith in human kindness was broken. The Oroids could no longer trust implicitly in each other. A gradual distrust arose, a growing unrest, a dissatisfaction which made no demands at first, nor seemed indeed to have any definite grievances of any sort. From it there sprang leaders who by their greater intelligence created desire that fed and nourished their dissatisfaction, gave it a seemingly tangible goal that made it far more dangerous than it ever had been before. About a year ago there first came into prominence the man whom you saw this morning condemned to death. His name is Targo. He is a Malite, full-blooded, I believe, although he says not. For 20 years or more he has lived in Orlog, a city some 50 miles from Arite. His wife is an Oroid. Targo, by his eloquence and the power and force of his personality, won a large following in Orlog, and, to a lesser degree, in many other cities. Twice, some months ago, he was arrested and reprimanded, the last time with a warning that a third offense would mean his death. "What is he after?" asked the Very Young Man. The Targos, as they are called, demand principally a different division of the land. Under the present system, approximately 1/3 of all the land is in the hands of the government. Of that, generally, more than half lies idle most of the time. The Targos wish to have this land divided among the citizens. They claim also that most of the city organizations do not produce as large a dividend as the Targos could show under their own management. They have many other grievances that there is no reason for me to detail. "Why not let them try out their theories in some city?" suggested the Big Business Man. "They are trying them," the Chemist answered. "There was a revolution in Orlog about 6 months ago. Several of its officials were assassinated, almost the first murders we have ever had. The Targos took possession of the government. A brother of this man you saw this morning became leader of the city. Orlog withdrew from the Oroid government and is now handling its affairs as a separate nation." "I wonder," began the Big Business Man thoughtfully. "Well, why not let them run it that way, if they want to?" "No reason if they were sincere. But they are not sincere nor honest fundamentally. Their leaders are for the most part Malites, or Oroids with Malite blood, and they are fooling the people. Their followers are all the more unintelligent, more gullible individuals, or those in whom there lies a latent criminal streak. The thing doesn't work. Sexual license is growing in Orlog. Crimes against women are becoming more and more frequent. Offenses committed by those prominent or in authority go unpunished. Women's testimony is discredited, often by concerted lying on the part of men witnesses. Many families are leaving Orlog, leaving their land and their homes deserted. In other cities where the Targos threaten to gain control, the same thing is happening. Most of these refugees come to Arite. We cannot take care of them. There is not enough land here." "Why not take your army and clean them up?" suggested the Very Young Man. They were seated around the little table at which Lylda was serving lunch. At the question She stopped in the act of pouring a steaming liquid from a little metal kettle into their dainty golden drinking cups, and looked at the Very Young Man gravely. "Very easy it would be to do that, perhaps," she said quietly. "But these Targos, except a few, they are our own people, and they too are armed. We cannot fight them. We cannot kill them, our own people." "We may have to," said the Chemist. "But you see, I did not realize, I could not believe the extent to which this Targo could sway the people. Nor did I at first realize what evils would result if his ideas were carried out. He has many followers right here in Arite. You saw that this morning." "How did you catch him?" interrupted the Very Young Man. "Yesterday he came to Arite," said Lylda. "He came to speak. With him came 50 others. With them, too, came his wife to speak here to our women. He thought we would do nothing. He defied us. There was a fight this morning, and many were killed. And we brought him to the court. You saw." "It's a serious situation," said the Doctor. "I had no idea." "We can handle it. We must handle it," said the Chemist. "But, as Lylda says, we cannot kill our own people. Only as a last desperate measure." "Suppose you wait too long," suggested the Big Business Man. "You say these Targos are gaining strength every day. You might have a very bad civil war." "That was the problem," answered the Chemist. "But now you come," said Lylda. "You change it all when you come down to us out of the great beyond. Our people, they call you genii of the Master. They " "Oh, gee, I never thought of that," murmured the Very Young Man. "What do you think of us?" "They think you are supernatural beings, of course," the Chemist said, smiling. "Yet they accept you without fear, and they look to you and to me for help." "This morning, there at the court," said Lylda, "I heard them say that Targo spoke against you. Devils, he said, from the great blue star, come here with evil for us all. And they believe him, some of them. It was for that perhaps they acted as they did before the court. In Arite now many believe in Targo, and it is bad, very bad." "The truth is," added the Chemist, "your coming, while it gives us unlimited possibilities for commanding the course of events, at the same time has precipitated the crisis. Naturally, no one can understand who or what you are, and as Lylda says, the Targos undoubtedly are telling the people you come to ally yourself with me for evil. There will be thousands who will listen to them and fear and hate you, especially in some of the other cities." "What does the king say?" asked the Doctor. "You will see him to morrow. He has been anxiously waiting for you. But you must not forget," the Chemist added with a smile, "the king has had little experience facing strife or evil doing of any kind. It was almost unknown until recently. It is I and you, gentlemen, who are facing the problem of saving this nation." The Very Young Man's face was flushed, and his eyes sparkled with excitement. "We can do anything we like," he said. "We have the power." "Aye, that is it," said Lylda. "The power we have. But, my friend, we cannot use it. Not for strife, for death. We cannot." "The execution of Targo will cause more trouble," said the Chemist thoughtfully. "It is bound to make " "When will you put him to death?" asked the Big Business Man. "To morrow he dies," Lylda answered. "To morrow, before the time of sleep." "There will be trouble," said the Chemist again. "We are in no personal danger, of course, but for the people who now believe in Targo, I am afraid " "A plan I have made," said Lylda. She sat forward tensely in her chair, brushing her hair back from her face with a swift gesture. "A plan I have made. It is the only way I now think that maybe there comes no harm to our people. It is that we want to do, if we can." She spoke eagerly, and without waiting for them to answer, went on swiftly. "This drug you have brought, I shall take it. And I shall get big. Oh, Not so very big, but big enough to be the height of a man, it may be 10 times. Then shall I talk to the people, I, Lylda, woman of the Master, and then shall I tell them that this power, this magic is for good, not for evil, if only they will give up Targo and all who are with him." "I will take it with you," said the Chemist. "Together we—" "No, no, my husband. Alone I must do this. Ah, do you not know? They say these stranger devils come with their magic for evil. And you too, you must not forget, once were a stranger just as they. That the people know, that they remember. But I, Lylda, a woman of the Oroids, I am full-blooded Oroid, no stranger. They will believe me a woman, for they know I cannot lie. I shall tell them I am for good, for kindness, for all we had that time before the Malite war, when everyone was happy. And if they will not believe, if, as I say, they will not do, then shall my power be indeed for evil, and all who will obey me not shall die, but they will believe. No need will there be to threaten. To many cities I will go, and in them all of those who want to live by Targo's law will I send to Orlog. And all in Orlog who believe him not will I tell to leave, and to the other cities go to make their homes. Then Orlog shall be Targo's city, and tomorrow he will not die, but go there into Orlog and become their king. For I shall say, it may be there are some who like his rule of evil, or it may be he is good in different fashion, and in time can make us see how his law too is just and kind. Then shall live in Orlog all who wish to stay, and we shall watch their rule, but never shall we let them pass beyond their borders, for if they do, then shall we kill them. All this I can do, my husband, if you but will let me try. For me they will believe, a woman, Oroid, all of blood, for they know women do not lie." She stopped, and the fire in her eyes changed to a look of gentle pleading. "If you will but let me try," she finished. "My husband, please." The Chemist glanced at his friends, who sat astonished by this flow of eager, impassioned words. Then he turned again to Lylda's intent, pleading face, regarding her tenderly. "You are very fine, little mother of my son," he said gently, lapsing for a moment into her own style of speech. "It could do no harm," he added thoughtfully, "and perhaps—" "Let her try it," said the Doctor. "No harm could come to her." "No harm to me could come," said Lylda quickly. "And I shall make them believe I can, because I am a woman, and they will know that I tell the truth. Ah, you will let me try, my husband, please?" The Chemist appealed to the others. "They will believe her, many of them," he said. "They will leave Orlog as she directs. But those in other cities will still hold to Targo. They will simply remain silent for a time. What their feelings will be or are, we cannot tell. Some will leave, and go to Orlog, of course, for Lylda will offer freedom of their leader, and to secure that they will seem to agree to anything. But after all, they are nothing but children at heart, most of them. Today they might believe in Lylda. Tomorrow Targo could win them again." "He won't get a chance," put in the Very Young Man quickly. "If she says we kill anybody who talks for Targo outside of Orlog, that goes. It's the only way, isn't it?" "And she might really convince them, or most of them," added the Doctor. "You will let me try?" asked Lylda softly. The Chemist nodded. Lylda sprang to her feet. Her frail little body was trembling with emotion. On her face was a look almost of exultation. "You will let me try?" she cried. "Then I shall make them believe. Here, now, this very hour, I shall make them know the truth, and they, my own people, shall I save from sorrow, misery, and death." She turned to the Chemist and spoke rapidly. "My husband, will you send Oteo now up into the city? Him you will tell to have others spread the news. All who desire an end to Targo's rule shall come here at once. And all, too, who believe in him and who for him want freedom, they shall come too. Let Oteo tell them magic shall be performed, and Lylda will speak with them. Make haste, my husband, for now I go to change my dress. Not as the master's woman will I speak, but as Lylda, Oroid woman, woman of the people." And with a flashing glance she turned and swiftly left the balcony. End of chapter 23. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lylda acts. "She'll do it," the Very Young Man murmured, staring at the doorway through which Lylda had disappeared. "She can do anything." The Chemist rose to his feet. "I'll send Oteo. Will you wait here, gentlemen? And will you have some of the drugs ready for Lylda? You have them with you?" The men nodded. "How about Lylda carrying the drugs?" asked the Very Young Man. "And what about her clothes?" "I have already made a belt for Lylda and for myself, some time ago," the Chemist answered. "During the first year I was here I made several experiments with the drugs. I found that almost anything within the immediate, shall I say, influence of the body will contract with it. Almost any garment, even a loose robe, will change size. You found that to be so to some extent. Those belts you wore down." "That's true," agreed the Doctor. "There seems to be considerable latitude." "I decided," the Chemist went on, "that immediately after your arrival we should all wear the drugs constantly. You can use the armpit pouches if you wish. Lylda and I will wear these belts I have made." Oteo, the Chemist's personal servant, a slim youth with a bright intelligent face, listened carefully to his master's directions, and then left the house hurriedly, running up the street towards the center of the city. Once or twice he stopped and spoke to passers-by for a moment, gathering a crowd around him each time. The Chemist rejoined his friends on the balcony. "There will be 1,000 people here in half an hour," he said quietly. "I have sent a message to the men in charge of the government workshops. They will have their people cease work to come here." Lylda appeared in a few moments more. She was dressed as the Chemist had seen her first through the microscope, in a short gray skirt reaching from waist to knees, only now she wore also 2 circular metal discs strapped over her breasts. Her hair was unbound and fell in masses forward over her shoulder. Around her waist was a broad girdle of golden cloth with small pouches for holding the chemicals. She took her place among the men quietly. "See, I am ready," she said with a smile. "Oteo, you have sent him?" The Chemist nodded. Lylda turned to the Doctor. "You will tell me what is to do with the drugs." They explained in a few words. By now a considerable crowd had gathered before the house, and up the street many others were hurrying down. Directly across from the entrance to Lylda's garden, back of the bluff at the lake front, was a large open space with a fringe of trees at its back. In this open space the crowd was collecting. The Chemist rose after a moment, and from the rooftop spoke a few words to the people in the street below. They answered him with shouts of applause mingled with a hum of murmured anger underneath. The Chemist went back to his friends, his face set and serious. As he dropped in his chair, Lylda knelt on the floor before him, laying her arms on his knees. "I go to do for our people the best I can," she said softly, looking up into his face. "Now I go, but to you I will come back soon." The Chemist tenderly put his hand upon the glossy smoothness of her hair. "I go now," she repeated, and reached for one of the vials under her arm. Holding it in her hand, she stared at it a moment silently in awe. Then she shuddered like a frightened child and buried her face in the Chemist's lap, huddling her little body up close against his legs as if for protection. The Chemist did not move nor speak, but sat quiet with his hand gently stroking her hair. In a moment she again raised her face to his. Her long lashes were wet with tears, but her lips were smiling. "I am ready now," she said gently. She brushed her tears from her eyes and rose to her feet. Drawing herself to her full height, she tossed back her head and flung out her arms before her. "No one can know I am afraid but you," she said, "and I shall forget." She dropped her arms and stood passive. "I go now to take the drug, there in the little garden behind, where no one can notice. You will come down?" The Big Business Man cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was tremulous with emotion. "How long will you be gone, Lylda?" he asked. The woman turned to him with a smile. "Soon I will return, so I believe," she answered. "I go to Orlog, then to Ratio and to Telly. But never shall I wait nor speak long, and fast will I walk. Before the time of sleep has descended upon us, I shall be here." In the little garden behind the house, out of sight of the crowd, on the other side, Lylda prepared to take the drug. She was standing there with the four men when Loto burst upon them, throwing himself into his mother's arms. "Oh, mamita, mamita," he cried, clinging to her. "There in the street outside they say such terrible things of you, mamita. The Master's woman, I heard one say. She has the evil magic, and another spoke of Targo, and they say he must not die, or there will be death for those who kill him." Lylda held the boy close as he poured out his breathless, frightened words. "No matter, little son," she said tenderly. "To mamita no harm can come. You shall see. Did my father teach you well today?" "But mamita, one man who saw me standing called me an evil name and spoke of you, my mother Lylda. And a woman looked with a look I never saw before. I am afraid, mamita." With quivering lips that smiled, Lylda kissed the little boy tenderly, and, gently loosing his hold, pushed him toward his father. "The Master's son, Loto, can never be afraid," she said with gentle reproof. "That you must remember always." The little group in the garden, close up against the house, stood silent as Lylda took a few grains of the drug. The noise and shouts of the crowd in front were now plainly audible. One voice was raised above the others, as though someone were making a speech. Loto stood beside his father, and the Chemist laid his arm across the boy's shoulder. As Lylda began visibly to increase in size, the boy uttered a startled cry. Meeting his mother's steady gaze, he shut his lips tight and stood rigid, watching her with wide, horrified eyes. Lylda had grown nearly twice her normal size before she spoke. Then, smiling down at the men, she said evenly, "From the roof, perhaps, you will watch?" "You know what to do if you grow too large," the Doctor said huskily. "I know, my friend. I thank you all, and good bye." She met the Chemist's glance an instant. Then abruptly she faced about, and walking close to the house, stood at its further corner, facing the lake. After a moment's hesitation, the Chemist led his friends to the roof. As they appeared at the edge of the parapet, a great shout rolled up from the crowd below. Nearly 1,000 people had gathered. The street was crowded, and in the open space beyond they stood in little groups. On a slight eminence near the lake bluff a man stood haranguing those around him. He was a short, very thick set little man with very long arms, a squat, ape-like figure. He talked loudly and indignantly. Around him perhaps 100 people stood listening, applauding at intervals. When the Chemist appeared, this man stopped with a final phrase of vituperation and a wave of his fist toward the house. The Chemist stood silent, looking out over the throng. "How large is she now?" he asked the Very Young Man softly. The Very Young Man ran across the roof to its farther corner and was back in an instant. "They'll see her soon. Look there." His friends turned at his words. At the corner of the house they could just see the top of Lylda's head above the edge of the parapet. As they watched, she grew still taller, and in another moment her forehead appeared. She turned her head, and her great eyes smiled softly at them across the rooftop. In a few moments more she had evidently stopped growing. With a farewell glance at her husband, she stepped around the corner of the house into full view of the crowd. A woman over 60 feet tall, standing quietly in the garden with one hand resting upon the roof of the house behind her. A cry of terror rose from the people as she appeared. Most of those in the street ran in fright back into the field behind. Then, seeing her standing motionless with a gentle smile on her face, they stopped, irresolute. A few held their ground, frankly curious and unafraid. Others stood sullen and defiant. When the people had quieted a little, Lylda raised her arms in greeting and spoke, softly, yet with a voice that carried far away over the field. As she talked, the people seemed to recover their composure rapidly. Her tremendous size no longer seemed to horrify them. Those who obviously at first were friendly appeared now quite at ease. The others, with their lessening terror, were visibly more hostile. Once Lylda mentioned the name of Targo. A scattered shout came up from the crowd. The ape-like man shouted out something to those near him, and then, leaving his knoll, disappeared. As Lylda continued, the hostile element in the crowd grew more insistent. They did not listen to her now, but shouted back in derision and defiance. Then suddenly a stone was thrown. It struck Lylda on the breast, hitting her metal breastplate with a thud and dropping at her feet. As though at a signal, a hail of stones flew up from the crowd, most of them striking Lylda like tiny pebbles, a few of the larger ones bounding against the house or landing on its roof. At this attack Lylda abruptly stopped speaking and took a step forward menacingly. The hail of stones continued. Then she turned towards the rooftop where the men and the little boy stood behind the parapet, sheltering themselves from the flying stones. "Only one way there is," said Lylda sadly, in a soft whisper that they plainly heard above the noise of the crowd. "I am sorry, my husband, but I must." A stone struck her shoulder. She faced the crowd again. A gentle look of sorrow was in her eyes, but her mouth was stern. In the street below, at the edge of the field, the squat little man had reappeared. It was from here that most of the stones seemed to come. "That man there by the road," the Chemist pointed. "One of Targo's?" In 3 swift steps Lylda was across the garden with one foot over the wall into the street. Reaching down, she caught the man between her huge fingers and held him high over her head an instant so that all might see. The big crowd was silent with terror. The man high in the air over their heads screamed horribly. Lylda hesitated only a moment more, and then she threw back her arm and, with a great sweep, flung her screaming victim far out into the lake. End of chapter 24. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This recording is in the public domain. The Escape of Targo. "I'm very much afraid it was a wrong move," said the Chemist gravely. They were sitting in a corner of the roof, talking over the situation. Lylda had left the city. The last they had seen of her, she was striding rapidly away, over the country towards Orlog. The street and field before the house was now nearly deserted. "She had to do it, of course," the Chemist continued. "But to kill Targo's brother—" "I wonder," began the Big Business Man thoughtfully. "It seems to me this disturbance is becoming far more serious than we think. It isn't so much a political issue now between your government and the followers of Targo, as it is a struggle against those of us who have this magic, as they call it." "That's just the point," put in the Doctor quickly. "They are making the people believe that our power of changing size is a menace that—" "If I had only realized," said the Chemist. "I thought your coming would help. Apparently it was the very worst thing that could have happened." "Not for you personally," interjected the Very Young Man. "We're perfectly safe, and Lylda and Loto." He put his arm affectionately around the boy who sat close beside him. "You are not afraid, are you, Loto?" "No, I am not," answered the boy seriously. "But this morning, when I left my grandfather, coming home—" "You were afraid for your mother, that was it, wasn't it?" finished the Very Young Man. "Does your grandfather teach you?" "Yes, he and father and mother." "I want you to see Lylda's father," said the Chemist. "There is nothing we can do now until Lylda returns. Shall we walk up there?" They all agreed readily. "I may go too?" Loto asked, looking at his father. "You have your lessons," said the Chemist. "But, my father, it is so very lonely without mother," protested the boy. The Chemist smiled gently. "Afraid, little son, to stay with Oteo?" "He's not afraid," said the Very Young Man stoutly. The little boy looked from one to the other of them a moment silently. Then, calling Oteo's name, he ran across the roof and down into the house. "5 years ago," said the Chemist, as the child disappeared, "there was hardly such an emotion in this world as fear or hate or anger. Now the pendulum is swinging to the other extreme. I suppose that's natural, but—" He ended with a sigh, and, breaking his train of thought, rose to his feet. "Shall we start?" Lylda's father greeted them gravely, with a dignity and yet obvious cordiality that was quite in accord with his appearance. He was a man over 60. His still luxuriant white hair fell to his shoulders. His face was hairless, for in this land all men's faces were as devoid of hair as those of the women. He was dressed in a long flowing robe similar to those his visitors were wearing. "Because you come I am glad," he said with a smile, as he shook hands in their own manner. He spoke slowly, with frequent pauses, as though carefully picking his words. "But, an old man, I know not the language of you." He led them into a room that evidently was his study, for in it they saw many strange instruments, and on a table a number of loosely bound sheets of parchment that were his books. They took the seats he offered and looked around them curiously. "There is the clock we spoke of," said the Chemist, indicating one of the larger instruments that stood on a pedestal in a corner of the room. "Reoh will explain it to you." Their host addressed the Chemist. "From Oteo, I hear, the news today is bad?" he asked with evident concern. "I'm afraid it is," the Chemist answered seriously. "And Lylda?" The Chemist recounted briefly the events of the day. "We can only wait until Lylda returns," he finished. "Tomorrow we will talk with the king." "Bad it is," said the old man slowly. "Very bad. But we shall see." The Very Young Man had risen to his feet and was standing beside the clock. "How does it work?" he asked. "What time is it now?" Reoh appealed to his son in law. "Tell of it. The words I not know." The Chemist smiled. "You are too modest, my father, but I will help you out if you insist." He turned to the others who were gathered around him, looking at the clock. "Our measurement of time here," he began, "like yours, is based on—" "Excuse me," interrupted the Very Young Man. "I just want to know first what time it is now." "It is in the fourth eclipse," said the Chemist with a twinkle. The Very Young Man was too surprised by this unexpected answer to question further, and the Chemist went on. "We measure time by the astronomical movements, just as you do in your world. One of the larger stars has a satellite which revolves around it with extreme rapidity. Here at Arite this satellite passes nearly always directly behind its controlling star. In other words, it is eclipsed. 10 of these eclipses measure the passage of our day. We rise generally at the first eclipse, or about that time. It is now the fourth eclipse. You would call it late afternoon. Do you see?" "How is the time gauged here?" asked the Big Business Man, indicating the clock. The instrument stood upon a low stone pedestal. It consisted of a transparent cylinder about 12 inches in diameter and some 4 feet high, surmounted by a large circular bowl. The cylinder was separated from the bowl by a broad disc of porous stone. A similar stone section divided the cylinder horizontally into halves. From the bowl a fluid was dropping in a tiny stream through the top stone segment into the upper compartment, which was now about half full. This in turn filtered through the second stone into the lower compartment. This lower section was marked in front with a large number of fine horizontal lines, an equal distance apart, but of unequal length. In it the fluid stood now just above one of the longer lines, the fourth from the bottom. On the top of this fluid floated a circular disc almost the size of the inside diameter of the cylinder. The Chemist explained. "It is really very much like the old hourglass we used to have in your world. This filters liquid instead of sand. You will notice the water filters twice." He indicated the 2 compartments. "That is because it is necessary to have a liquid that is absolutely pure in order that the rate at which it filters through this other stone may remain constant. The clock is carefully tested so that for each eclipse the water will rise in this lower part of the cylinder just the distance from here to here." The Chemist put his fingers on 2 of the longer marks. "Very ingenious," remarked the Doctor. "Is it accurate?" "Not so accurate as your watches, of course," the Chemist answered, "but still it serves the purpose. These 10 longer lines you see mark the 10 eclipses that constitute one of our days. The shorter lines between indicate halves and quarter intervals." "Then it is only good for one day?" asked the Very Young Man. "How do you set it?" "It resets automatically each day at the beginning of the first eclipse. This disc," the Chemist pointed to the disc floating on the water in the lower compartment, "this disc rises with the water on which it is floating. When it reaches the top of it, it comes in contact with a simple mechanism you see it up there which opens a gate below and drains out the water in a moment, so that every morning it is emptied and starts filling up again. All that is needed is to keep this bowl full of water." "It certainly seems very practical," observed the Big Business Man. "Are there many in use?" "Quite a number, yes. This clock was invented by Rio some 30 years ago. He is the greatest scientist and scholar we have." The old man smiled deprecatingly at this compliment. "Are these books?" asked the Very Young Man. He had wandered over to the table and was fingering one of the bound sheets of parchment. "They are Rio's chronicles," the Chemist answered. "The only ones of their kind in Arite." "What's this?" The Very Young Man pointed to another instrument. "That is an astronomical instrument, something like a sextant, also an invention of Rio's. Here is a small telescope, and The Chemist paused and went over to another table standing at the side of the room. "That reminds me, gentlemen," he continued, "I have something here in which you will be greatly interested." "What you will see," said Reoh softly, as they gathered around the Chemist, "you only, of all people, can understand. Each day I look, and I wonder, but never can I quite believe." "I made this myself nearly 10 years ago," said the Chemist, lifting up the instrument, a microscope. "It is not very large, you see, nor is it very powerful, but I want you to look through it." With his cigar lighter he ignited a short length of wire that burned slowly with a brilliant blue spot of light. In his hand he held a small piece of stone. "I made this microscope hoping that I might prove with it still more conclusively my original theory of the infinite smallness of human life. For many months I searched into various objects, but without success. Finally I came upon this bit of rock." The Chemist adjusted it carefully under the microscope with the light shining brilliantly upon it. "You see I have marked one place. I am going to let you look into it there." The Doctor stepped forward. As he looked they heard his quick intake of breath. After a moment he raised his head. On his face was an expression of awe too deep for words. He made place for the others and stood silent. When the Very Young Man's turn came he looked into the eyepiece awkwardly. His heart was beating fast. For some reason he felt frightened. At first he saw nothing. "Keep the other eye open," said the Chemist. The Very Young Man did as he was directed. After a moment there appeared before him a vast stretch of open country. As from a great height he stared down at the scene spread out below him. Gradually it became clearer. He saw water with the sunlight, his own kind of sunlight it seemed, shining upon it. He stared for a moment more, dazzled by the light. Then nearer to him he saw a grassy slope that seemed to be on a mountainside above the water. On this slope he saw animals grazing, and beside them a man formed like himself. The Chemist's voice came to him from far away. "We are all of us here in a world that only occupies a portion of one little atom of the gold of a wedding ring. Yet what you see there in that stone—" The Very Young Man raised his head. Before him stood the microscope with its fragment of stone gleaming in the blue light of the burning wire. He wanted to say something to show them how he felt, but no words came. He looked up into the Chemist's smiling face and smiled back a little foolishly. "Every day I look," said Reoh, breaking the silence, "and I see wonderful things, but never really can I believe." At this moment there came a violent rapping upon the outer door. As Reoh left the room to open it, the Very Young Man picked up the bit of stone that the Chemist had just taken from the microscope. "I wish—may I keep it?" he asked impulsively. The Chemist smiled and nodded, and the Very Young Man was about to slip it into the pocket of his robe when Reoh hastily re-entered the room, followed by Oteo. The youth was breathing heavily, as though he had been running, and on his face was a frightened look. "Bad, very bad," said the old man in a tone of deep concern as they came through the doorway. "What is it, Oteo?" asked the Chemist quickly. The boy answered him with a flood of words in his native tongue. The Chemist listened quietly, then he turned to his companions. "Targo has escaped," he said briefly. "They sent word to me at home, and Oteo ran here to tell me. A crowd broke into the courthouse and released him. Oteo says they went away by water, and that no one is following them." The youth, who evidently understood English, added something else in his own language. "He says Targo vowed death to all who have the magic power. He spoke in the city just now and promised them deliverance from the giants." "Good Lord," murmured the Very Young Man. "He has gone to Orlog probably," the Chemist continued. We have nothing to fear for the moment. But that he could speak in the center of Arite after this morning, and that the people would listen. "It seems to me things are getting worse every minute," said the Big Business Man. Oteo spoke again. The Chemist translated. "The police did nothing. They simply stood and listened, but took no part." "Bad, very bad," repeated the old man, shaking his head. "What should we do? I confess I cannot tell," said the Chemist soberly. "But that we should do something drastic is obvious." "We can't do anything until Lylda gets back," declared the Very Young Man. "We'll see what she has done. We might have had to let Targo go, anyway." The Chemist started towards the door. "Tonight, by the time of sleep, Reoh," he said to the old man, "I expect Lylda will have returned. You had better come to us then with Aura. I do not think you should stay here alone to sleep tonight." "In a moment Aura comes," Reoh answered. "We shall be with you very soon." The Chemist motioned to his companions, and with obvious reluctance on the part of the Very Young Man, they left, followed by Oteo. On the way back the city seemed quiet, abnormally so. The streets were nearly deserted. What few pedestrians they met avoided them or passed them sullenly. They were perhaps halfway back to the Chemist's house when the Very Young Man stopped short. "I forgot that piece of stone," he explained, looking at them queerly. "Go on. I'll be there by the time you are." And disregarding the Chemist's admonition that he might get lost, he left them abruptly and walked swiftly back over the way they had come. Without difficulty, for they had made few turns, the Very Young Man located Reoh's house. As he approached, he noticed the figure of a man lounging against the further corner of the building. The figure disappeared almost as soon as he saw it. It was a trivial incident, but somehow, to the Very Young Man, it held something in it of impending danger. He did not knock on the outer door, but finding it partly open, he slowly pushed it wider and stepped quietly into the hallway beyond. He was hardly inside when there came from within the house a girl's scream, a cry of horror abruptly stifled. For an instant the Very Young Man stood hesitating. Then he dashed forward through an open doorway in the direction from which the cry had seemed to come. The room into which he burst was Reoh's study, the room he had left only a few moments before. On the floor, almost across his path, lay the old man, with the short blade of a sword buried to the hilt in his breast. In a corner of the room a young Oroid girl stood with her back against the wall. Her hands were pressed against her mouth, her eyes were wide with terror. Bending over the body on the floor, with a hand in its armpit, knelt the huge gray figure of a man. At the sound of the intruder's entrance he looked up quickly and sprang to his feet. The Very Young Man saw it was Targo. End of chapter 25. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Abduction. When the Very Young Man left them so unceremoniously, the Chemist and his companions continued on their way home, talking earnestly over the serious turn affairs had taken. Of the three, the Big Business Man appeared the most perturbed. "Lylda isn't going to accomplish anything," he said. "It won't work. The thing has gone too far. It isn't politics any longer. It's a struggle against us, a hatred and fear of our supernatural powers." "If we had never come," began the Doctor. "It probably would have worked out all right," finished the Big Business Man. "But since we're here " "We could leave," the Doctor suggested. "It has gone too far. I agree with you," the Chemist said. "Your going would not help. They would never believe I did not still possess the magic. And now, without the drugs, I might not be able to cope with affairs. It is a very serious situation." "And getting worse all the time," added the Big Business Man. When they arrived at the Chemist's home, Loto did not run out to meet them as the Chemist expected. They called his name, but there was no answer. Inside the house they perceived at once that something was wrong. The living room was in disorder. Some of the pieces of furniture had been overturned, and many of the smaller articles were scattered about the floor. Even the wall hangings had been torn down. In sudden fear the Chemist ran through the building, calling to Loto. Everywhere he saw evidence of intruders, who had ransacked the rooms as though making a hasty search. In one of the rooms, crouched on the floor, he came upon Eena, Lylda's little serving maid. The girl was stricken dumb with terror. At the sight of her master she sobbed with relief, and after a few moments told him what had happened. When the Chemist rejoined his friends in the lower room, his face was set and white. The girl followed him closely, evidently afraid to be left alone. The Chemist spoke quietly, controlling his emotion with obvious difficulty. "Loto has been stolen," he said. "Targo and 4 of his men were here soon after we left. Eena saw them and hid." "They searched the house for the drugs," muttered the Doctor under his breath, "and then left, taking Loto with them." "Which way did they go?" asked the Big Business Man. "Good God, what a thing!" "They went by water in a large boat that was waiting for them here," answered the Chemist. "How long ago?" asked the Doctor quickly. "We have not been gone very long." "An hour probably, not much more. Eena said something to her master, and began to cry softly. She says they left a little while ago. 3 of the men took Loto away in the boat. She watched them from the window upstairs." "Targo, Aliyah," said the girl. "One of the men was Targo," said the Chemist. He went to one of the windows overlooking the lake. The Doctor stood beside him. There was no boat in sight. "They could not have got very far," said the Doctor. "Those islands there." "They would take him to Orlog," said the Chemist. "About 50 miles." The Doctor turned back to the room. "We can get them. You forget these drugs the power they give us. Oh, Will!" He called the Big Business Man over to them. He spoke hurriedly, with growing excitement. "What do you think, Will? That boat they've got Loto. It can't be very far. We can make ourselves so large in half an hour we can wade all over the lake. We can get it. What do you think?" The Chemist dropped into a chair with his head in his hands. "Let me think. Just a moment, Frank. I know the power we have. I know we can do almost anything. That little boy of mine, they've got him. Let me think. Just a moment." He sat motionless. The Doctor continued talking in a lower tone to the Big Business Man by the window. In the doorway Oteo stood like a statue, motionless, except for his big soft eyes that roved unceasingly over the scene before him. After a moment Eena ceased her sobbing and knelt beside the Chemist, looking up at him sorrowfully. "I cannot believe," said the Chemist finally, raising his head, "that the safest way to rescue Loto is by the plan you have suggested." He spoke with his usual calm, judicial manner, having regained control of himself completely. "I understand now thoroughly and for the first time the situation we are facing. It is, as you say, a political issue no longer. Targo and his closest followers have convinced a very large proportion of our entire nation. I am certain that myself and my family and you, the strangers, are possessed of a diabolical power that must be annihilated. Targo will never rest until he has the drugs. That is why he searched this house. He has abducted Loto for the same purpose. He will not hurt Loto. I am convinced of that. Probably he will send someone tomorrow to demand the drugs as the price of Loto's life. But don't you understand? Targo and his advisers, and even the most ignorant of our people, realize what power we have. Lylda showed them that when she flung Targo's brother out into the lake today. But we cannot use this power openly, for, while it makes us invincible, it makes them correspondingly desperate. They are a peculiar people. Throughout the whole history of the race they have been kindly, thoughtless children. Now they are aroused. The pendulum has swung to the other extreme. They care little for their lives. They are still children, children who will go to their death unreasoning, fighting against invincibility. That is something we must never overlook, for it is a fact. We cannot run amuck as giants over this world and hope to conquer it. We could conquer it, yes, but only when the last of its inhabitants have been killed, stamped out like ants defending their hill from the attacks of an elephant. Don't you see I am right?" "Then Lylda," began the Doctor, as the Chemist paused. "Lylda will fail. Her venture today will make matters immeasurably worse." "You're right," agreed the Big Business Man. "We should have realized." "So you see, we cannot make ourselves large and recapture Loto by force. They would anticipate us and kill him." "Then what shall we do?" demanded the Doctor. "We must do something." "That we must decide carefully, for we must make no more mistakes. But we can do nothing at this moment. The lives of all of us are threatened. We must not allow ourselves to become separated. We must wait here for Lylda. Rio and Aura must stay with us. Then we can decide how to rescue Loto and what to do after that. But we must keep together." "Jack ought to be here by now," said the Big Business Man. "I hope Rio and Aura come with him." For over an hour they waited, and still the Very Young Man did not come. They had just decided to send Oteo to see what had become of him and to bring down Rio and his daughter, when Lylda unexpectedly returned. It was Eena, standing at one of the side windows, who first saw her mistress. A cry from the girl brought them all to the window. Far away beyond the city they could see the gigantic figure of Lylda towering several hundred feet in the air. As she came closer she seemed to stop near the outskirts of the city, and then they saw her dwindling in size until she disappeared, hidden from their view by the houses near at hand. In perhaps half an hour more she reappeared, picking her way carefully down the deserted street towards them. She was at this time about 40 feet tall. At the corner, 100 yards away from them, a little group of people ran out, and, with shouts of anger, threw something at her as she passed. She stooped down towards them, and immediately they scurried for safety out of her reach. Once inside her own garden, where the Chemist and his companions were waiting, Lylda lost no time in becoming her normal size again. As she grew smaller, she sat down with her back against a little tree. Her face was white and drawn. Her eyes were full of tears as she looked at her husband and his friends. When the drug had ceased to act, the Chemist sat beside her. She had started out only a few hours before, a crusader, dominant, forceful. She came back now a tired, discouraged little woman. The Chemist put his arm around her protectingly, drawing her drooping body towards him. "Very bad news, Lylda, we know," he said gently. "Oh, my husband," she cried brokenly. "So sorry I am, so very sorry. The best I knew I did, and it was all so very bad, so very bad." She broke off abruptly, looking at him with her great sorrowful eyes. "Tell us, Lylda," he said softly. "To many cities I went," she answered, "and I told the people all I meant to say. Some of them believed, but they were not many, and of the others who did not believe they were afraid, and so they kept silent. Then into Orlog I went, and in the public square I spoke for very long, because for some reason I know not, at first they listened. But no one there believed. And then, my husband, at last I knew why I could not hope to gain my way. It is not because they want Targo's rule that they oppose us. It was, but it is so no longer. It is because they have been made to fear these drugs we have. For now in Orlog they are shouting death to all the giants. Forgotten are all their cries for land, the things that Targo promised, and we in Arite would not give. It is death to all the giants they are shouting now, death to you, to me, to us all, because we have these drugs." "Did they attack you?" asked the Big Business Man. "Many things they threw," Lylda answered, "but I was so big." She smiled a sad little twisted smile. What could they do was as nothing. "And because of that they fear and hate us so. Yet never have I seen such fearless things as those they did. Death to the giants was their only cry. And I could have killed them, hundreds, thousands, yet never could I have made them stop while yet they were alive. I told them Targo I would free, and in Orlog they laughed, for they said he would free himself before I had returned." "He did," muttered the Big Business Man. "Targo escaped this afternoon," the Chemist explained. "He went to Orlog by boat and took—" He stopped abruptly. "Come into the house, Lylda," he added gently. "There are other things, my wife, of which we must speak." He rose to his feet, pulling her up with him. "Where is Jack?" she asked, looking at the Big Business Man, who stood watching her gravely. "And where is Loto? Does he not want to see his mother who tried so?" She put her arms around the Chemist's neck. "So very hard I tried," she finished softly. "So very hard because I thought—" The Chemist led her gently into the house. The Doctor started to follow, but the Big Business Man held him back. "It is better not," he said in an undertone. "Don't you think?" Oteo was standing near them, and the Big Business Man motioned to him. "Besides," he added, "I am worried about Jack. I think we ought to go up after him. I don't think it ought to take us very long." "With Oteo. He knows the way," agreed the Doctor. "It's devilish strange what's keeping that boy." They found that although Oteo spoke only a few words of English, he understood nearly everything they said, and waiting only a moment more, they started up into the city toward Reoh's home. In the living room of the house the Chemist sat Lylda gently down on a cushion in front of the hearth. Sitting beside her, he laid his hand on hers that rested on her knee. "For 12 years, Lylda, we have lived together," he began slowly, "and no sorrow has come to us, no danger has threatened us or those we loved." He met his wife's questioning gaze unflinchingly and went on. "You have proved yourself a wonderful woman, my wife. You never knew, nor those before you, the conflict of human passions. No danger before has ever threatened you or those you loved." He saw her eyes grow wider. "Very strange you talk, my husband. There is something—" "There is something, Lylda. Today you have seen strife, anger, hate, and death. You have met them all calmly. You have fought them all justly, like a woman, a brave, honest Oroid woman who can wrong no one. There is something now that I must tell you." He saw the growing fear in her eyes and hurried on. "Loto today, this afternoon—" The woman gave a little low cry of anguish, instantly repressed. Her hand gripped his tightly. "No, no, Lylda, not that," he said quickly. "But this afternoon, while we were all away, Loto was here alone with Eena. Targo and his men came. They did not hurt Loto. They took him away in a boat to Orlog." He stopped abruptly. Lylda's eyes never left his face. Her breath came fast. She put a hand to her mouth and stifled the cry that rose to her lips. "They will not hurt him, Lylda. That I know. And soon we will have him back." For a moment more her searching eyes stared steadily into his. He heard the whispered words, "My little son with Targo," come slowly from her lips. Then, with a low sobbing cry, she dropped senseless into his arms. End of chapter 26. of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Aura. The Very Young Man involuntarily took a step backwards as he met Targo's eyes glaring at him across the old man's body. The girl in the corner gave another cry, a cry of fright and horror, yet with a note of relief. The Very Young Man found himself wondering who she was. Then he knew. His first impulse was to leap across the room towards her. He thought of the chemicals, and instinctively his hand went to his armpit. But he knew there was no time for that. He hesitated one brief instant. As he stood rigid, Targo stooped swiftly and grasped the dagger in his victim's breast. The girl screamed again, louder this time, and like a mask the Very Young Man's indecision fell from him. He stood alert, clear-headed. Here was an enemy threatening him, an enemy he must fight and overcome. In the second that Targo bent down, the Very Young Man bounded forward, and with a leap that his football days had taught him so well how to make, he landed squarely upon the bare, broad back of his antagonist. The impact of his weight forced Targo down upon the floor, and losing his balance, he fell with the Very Young Man on top of him. They hit the leg of the table as they rolled over, and something dropped from it to the floor, striking the stone surface with a thud. The knife still stuck in the dead man's body. The Very Young Man thought he could reach it, but his opponent's great arms were around him now and held him too tightly. He tried to pull himself loose, but he could not. Then he rolled partly over again and met Targo's eyes above, leering triumphantly down at him. He looked away and wrenched his right arm free. Across the room he could see the girl still crouching in the corner. His right hand, sweeping along the floor, struck something heavy lying there. His fingers closed over it. He raised it up, and hardly knowing what he did, crashed it against his enemy's head. He felt the tense muscles of the man relax, and then the weight of his inert body as it pressed down upon him. He wriggled free and sprang to his feet. As he stood, weak and trembling, looking down at the unconscious form of Targo lying upon the floor, the girl suddenly ran over and stood beside him. Her slim little body came only a little above his shoulder. Instinctively he put his arm about her. A voice calling from outside the room made the girl look up into his face with new terror. "Others are coming," she whispered tensely, and huddled up against him. The Very Young Man saw that the room had two doors, the one through which he had entered, and another in one of its other walls. There were no windows. He pulled the girl now towards the further door, but she held him back. "They come that way," she whispered. Another voice sounded behind him, and the Very Young Man knew that a man was coming up along the passageway from the front entrance. Targo's men. He remembered now the skulking figure he had seen outside the house. There were more than two, for now he heard other voices, and someone calling Targo's name. He held the girl closer and stood motionless. Like rats in a trap, he thought. He felt the fingers of his right hand holding something heavy. It was a piece of stone. The stone he had looked at through the microscope. The stone with which he had struck Targo. He smiled to himself and slipped it into his pocket. The girl had slowly pulled him over to the inner wall of the room. The footsteps came closer. They would be here in a moment. The Very Young Man wondered how he should fight them all, and then he thought of the knife that was still in the murdered man's body. He thought he ought to get it now while there was still time. He heard a click, and the wall against which he and the girl were leaning yielded with their weight. A door swung open, a door the Very Young Man had not seen before. The girl pulled him through the doorway and swung the door softly closed behind them. The Very Young Man found himself now in a long, narrow room with a very high ceiling. It had, apparently, no other door and no windows. It was evidently a storeroom, piled high with what looked like boxes, and with bales of silks and other fabrics. The Very Young Man looked around him hastily. Then he let go of the girl, and since locks were unknown in this world, began piling as many heavy objects as possible against the door. The girl tried to help him, but he pushed her away. Once he put his ear to the door and listened. He heard voices outside in the strange Oroid tongue. The girl stood beside him. "They are lifting Targo up. He speaks. He is not dead," she whispered. For several minutes they stood there listening. The voices continued in a low murmur. "They know we are in here," said the Very Young Man finally, in an undertone. "Is there any other way out of this room?" The girl shook her head. The Very Young Man forgot the import of her answer, and suddenly found himself thinking she was the prettiest girl he had ever seen. She was hardly more than 16, with a slender, not yet matured, yet perfectly rounded little body. She wore, like Lylda, a short blue silk tunic, with a golden cord crossing her breast and encircling her waist. Her raven black hair hung in two twisted locks nearly to her knees. Her skin was very white, and even more than Lylda's, gleamed with iridescent color. "Only this one door," said the girl. The words brought the Very Young Man to himself with a start. No other way out of the room. He knew that Targo and his men would force their way in very soon. He could not prevent them, but it would take time. The Very Young Man remembered that now he had time to take the chemicals. He put his hand to his armpit and felt the pouch that held the drug. He wondered which to take. The ceiling was very high, but to fight in the narrow confines of such a room. He led the girl over to a pile of cushions and sat down beside her. "Listen," he said briefly. "We are going to take a medicine. It will make us very small. Then we will hide from Targo and his men till they are gone. This is not magic. It is science. Do you understand?" "I understand," the girl answered readily. "One of the strangers you are. My brother's friend." "You will not be afraid to take the drug?" "No." But though she spoke confidently, she drew closer to him and shivered a little. The Very Young Man handed her one of the tiny pellets. "Just touch it to the tip of your tongue as I do," he said warningly. They took the drug. When it had ceased to act, they found themselves standing on the rough, uneven stone surface that was the floor of the room. Far overhead, in the dim, luminous blackness, they could just make out the great, arching ceiling, stretching away out of sight down the length of the room. Beside them stood a tremendous shaggy pile of coarsely woven objects that were the silk pillows on which they had been sitting a moment before. Pillows that seemed 40 or 50 feet square now, and loomed high above their heads. The Very Young Man took the frightened girl by the hand and led her along the tremendous length of a pile of boxes, blocks long it seemed. The boxes, from their size, might have been rectangular, windowless houses jammed closely together and piled one upon the other up into the air almost out of sight. Finally they came to a broad passageway between the boxes, a mere crack it would have been before. They turned into it, and a few feet beyond came to a larger square space with a box making a roof over it some 20 feet above their head. From this retreat they could see the lower part of the door leading into the other room, and could hear from beyond it a muffled roar, the voices of Targo and his men. Hardly were they hidden when the door opened a little. It struck against the bales the Very Young Man had piled against it. For a moment it held, but with the united efforts of the men pushing from the other side, it slowly yielded and swung open. Targo stepped into the room. To the Very Young Man he seemed nearly 100 feet high. Only his feet and ankles were visible at first, from where the Very Young Man was watching. Three other men came in with him. They stamped back and forth for a time, moving some of the bales and boxes. Luckily, they left undisturbed those nearest the fugitives. After a moment they left, leaving the door open. The Very Young Man breathed a long sigh of relief. "Gosh, I'm glad that's over." He spoke in a low tone. Although the men in the other room seemed so far away, they would hardly have heard him if he had shouted at the top of his voice. Alone with the girl now, in this great silent room, the Very Young Man felt suddenly embarrassed. "I am one of your brother's friends," he said. "My name is Jack. Is yours Aura?" "Lylda's sister I am," she answered quietly. "My father told me about you." Then with a rush came the memory of her father's death, which the startling experiences of the past half hour had made her forget. Her big soft eyes filled with tears, and her lips quivered. Involuntarily the Very Young Man put his arm about her again and held her close to him. She was so little and frail, so pathetic and so wholly adorable. For a long time they sat in silence. Then the girl gently drew away. At the doorway they stood and listened. Targo and his followers were still in the adjoining room, talking earnestly. "Loto they have captured," Aura whispered suddenly. "Others of Targo's men have taken him in a boat to Orlog. Tomorrow they send a messenger to my brother to demand he gives up these drugs, or Loto they will kill." The Very Young Man waited, breathless. Suddenly he heard Targo laugh, a cruel, cynical laugh. Aura shuddered. "And when he has the drug, all of us will he kill, and all in the land too who will not do as he bids." The men were rising, evidently in preparation to leave. Aura continued. "They go now to Orlog, all but Targo. A little way from here, up the lake shore, a boat is waiting. It will take them there fast." With a last look around, Targo and his followers disappeared through the back door of the room. An outer door clanged noisily, and the Very Young Man and Aura were left alone in the house. Rio murdered, Loto stolen. The Very Young Man thought of Lylda and wondered if anything could have happened to her. "Did they speak of your sister?" he asked. "Targo said he would put her to death," Aura answered with a shudder. "He said she killed his brother today." She turned to the Very Young Man impulsively, putting her little hands up on his shoulders. "Oh, my friend," she exclaimed, "you can do something to save my family? Targo is so strong, so cruel. My father " She stopped and choked back a sob. "Did they say where Lylda was now?" "They did not know. She grew very big and went away." "Where is your brother and my two friends?" "Targo said they were here when he took Loto. Now they have gone home. He was afraid of them now because they have the drugs." "Tomorrow they are going to send a messenger from Orlog to demand the drugs." He said tomorrow. "Oh, will you do something for us? You can save Loto?" The Very Young Man was beginning to formulate a plan. "And tonight," he asked, "from what they said, are you sure they will not hurt Loto?" "They said no, but he is so little, so " The girl burst into tears, and at every sob the Very Young Man's heart leaped into his breast. He wanted to comfort her, but he could think of no word to say. He wanted to help her, to do the best thing in what he saw was a grave crisis. What he should have done was to have taken her back to the Chemist and his friends, and then with them planned the rescue of Loto. But with the girl's hand upon his shoulders, and her sorrowful little tear stained face looking up to his, he did not think of that. He only thought of her and her pathetic appeal. "You will do something, my friend?" "You can save Loto?" He could save Loto. With the power of the drugs he could do anything. The Very Young Man made a sudden decision. I don't know the way to Orlog. You do?" he asked abruptly. "Oh, yes, I know it well." "We will go to Orlog, you and I, now, and rescue Loto. You will not be afraid?" The girl's eyes looked into his with a clear, steady gaze. The Very Young Man stared down into their depths with his heart pounding. "I shall not be afraid with you," said the girl softly. The Very Young Man drew a long breath. He knew he must think it all out carefully. The drug would make them very large, and in a short time they could walk to Orlog. No harm could come to them. Once in Orlog they would find Loto, probably in Targo's palace, and bring him back with them. The Very Young Man pictured the surprise and gratification of the Chemist and his friends. Lylda would be back by then. No sooner would she have heard of Loto's loss than he would bring him back to her. Or perhaps they would meet Lylda and she would join them. The Very Young Man produced the drug and was about to give Aura one of the pellets when another thought occurred to him. Targo would not harm Loto now because he was valuable as a hostage. But suppose he saw these two giants coming to the rescue? The Very Young Man knew that probably the boy would be killed before he could save him. That way would not do. He would have to get to Orlog unseen, rescue Loto by a sudden rush before they could harm him. But first it would be necessary for him and Aura to get out of Arite quietly without causing any excitement. Once in the open country they could grow larger and travel rapidly to Orlog. The Very Young Man thought it would be best to be normal size while leaving Arite. He explained his plan to Aura briefly. It took several successive tastes of the different drugs before this result was accomplished, but in perhaps half an hour they were ready to leave the house. To the Very Young Man this change of size was no longer even startling. Aura, this time, with him beside her, seemed quite unafraid. "Now we're ready," said the Very Young Man in a matter-of-fact tone that was far from indicating his true feeling. "Take the way where we are least likely to be noticed, towards Orlog. When we get in the open country we can get bigger." He led the girl across Reoh's study. She kept her face averted as they passed the body lying on the floor, and in a moment they were outside the house. They walked rapidly, keeping close to the walls of the houses. The streets were nearly deserted, and no one seemed to notice them. The Very Young Man was calculating the time. "Probably they are just getting to Orlog with Loto," he said. "Once we get out of Arite we'll travel fast. We'll have him back in 2 or 3 hours." Aura said nothing, but walked beside him. Once or twice she looked back over her shoulder. They were in the outskirts of the city when suddenly the girl gripped her companion by the arm. "Someone behind us," she whispered. The Very Young Man resisted an impulse to look around. They had come to a cross street. The Very Young Man abruptly turned the corner, and clutching Aura by the hand, ran swiftly forward a short distance. When they had slowed down to a walk again, the Very Young Man looked cautiously back over his shoulder. As he did so, he caught a glimpse of 3 men who had just reached the corner, and who darted hastily back out of sight as he turned his head. End of chapter 27. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Attack on the Palace. Oteo led the 2 men swiftly through the city toward Reoh's house. There were few pedestrians about, and no one seemed particularly to notice them. Yet somehow, the Big Business Man thought, there hung about the city an ominous air of unrest. Perhaps it was the abnormal quiet, the solemn, sinister look of deserted streets, or perhaps it was an occasional face peering at them from a window, or a figure lurking in a doorway, disappearing at their approach. The Big Business Man found his heart beating fast. He suddenly felt very much alone. The realization came to him that he was in a strange world, surrounded by beings of another race, most of whom, he knew now, hated and feared him and those who had come with him. Then his thoughts took another turn. He looked up at the brilliant galaxy of stars overhead. New unexplored worlds, thousands, millions of them, in one tiny little atom of a woman's wedding ring. Then he thought of his friend, the banker. Perhaps the ring had not been moved from its place in the clubroom. Then he looked at the sky again. Then Broadway, only 30 feet away from him this moment. He smiled a little at this conception and drew a long breath, awed by his thoughts. Oteo was plucking at his sleeve and pointing. Across the street stood Reoh's house. The doctor knocked upon its partially open front door, and receiving no answer, they entered silently, with a dread sense of impending evil hanging over them. The doctor led the way into the old man's study. At the threshold he stopped, shocked into immobility. Upon the floor, with the knife still in it, lay Reoh's body. The doctor made a hasty examination, although the presence of the knife obviously made it unnecessary. A hurried search of the house convinced them that Aura and the Very Young Man were not there. The two men, confused by this double disaster, were at a loss to know what to do. "They've got him," said the Big Business Man with conviction. "And the girl, too, probably. He must have come back just as they were killing Reoh." "There wasn't much time," the doctor said. "He was back here in 10 minutes. But they've got him, you're right, or he would have been back with us before this. They'll take him and the girl to Orlog. They won't hurt them because they—" The Big Business Man stopped abruptly. His face went white. "Good God, Frank, do you realize? They've got the drugs now." Targo had the drugs. The Big Business Man shuddered with fear at the thought. Their situation would be desperate indeed if that were so. The doctor reasoned it out more calmly. "I hadn't thought of that," he said slowly, "and it makes me think perhaps they have not captured Jack. If they had the drugs they would lose no time in using them. They haven't used them yet, that's evident." The Big Business Man was about to reply when there came a shouting from the street outside, and the sound of many feet rushing past the house. They hurried to the door. A mob swept by, a mob of nearly 1,000 persons. Most of them were men. Some were armed with swords, others brandished huge stones or lengths of beaten gold implements, perhaps, with which they had been working, and which now they held as weapons. The mob ran swiftly, with vainglorious shouts from its leaders. It turned a corner near by and disappeared. From every house now people appeared, and soon the streets were full of scurrying pedestrians. Most of them followed the direction taken by the mob. The listeners in the doorway could hear now, from far away, the sounds of shouts and cheering. And from all around them came the buzz and hum of busy streets. The city was thoroughly awake, alert, and expectant. The Big Business Man flung the door wide. "I'm going to follow that crowd, see what's going on. We can't stay here in the midst of this." The doctor and Oteo followed him out into the street, and they mingled with the hastening crowd. In their excitement they walked freely among the people. No one appeared to notice them, for the crowd was as excited as they, hurrying along, heedless of its immediate surroundings. As they advanced, the street became more congested. Down another street they saw fighting going on, a weaponless crowd swaying and struggling aimlessly. A number of armed men charged this crowd, men who by their breastplates and swords the Big Business Man recognized as the police. The crowd ceased struggling and dispersed, only to gather again in another place. The city was in a turmoil of excitement without apparent reason or definite object. Yet there was a steady tide in the direction the first armed mob had gone, and with that tide went the Big Business Man and his two companions. After a time they came to an open park beyond which, on a prominence, with the lake behind, stood a large building that the Chemist had already pointed out to them as the King's Palace. Oteo led them swiftly into a side street to avoid the dense crowd around the park. Making a slight detour, they came back to it again, much nearer the palace now, and approached from behind a house that fronted the open space near the palace. "Friend of the master, his house," Oteo explained as he knocked peremptorily at a side door. They waited a moment, but no one came. Oteo pushed the door and led them within. The house was deserted, and following Oteo, they went to the roof. Here they could see perfectly what was going on around the palace and in the park below them. This park was nearly triangular in shape, 1,000 feet possibly on each side. At the base of the triangle, on a bluff with the lake behind it, stood the palace. Its main entrance, two huge golden doors, stood at the top of a broad flight of stone steps. On these steps a fight was in progress. A mob surged up them, repulsed at the top by a score or more of men armed with swords, who were defending the doorway. The square was thronged with people watching the palace steps and shouting almost continuously. The fight before the palace evidently had been in progress for some time. Many dead were lying in the doorway and on the steps below it. The few defenders had so far resisted successfully against tremendous odds, for the invaders, pressed upward by those behind, could not retreat and were being killed at the top from lack of space in which to fight. "Look there!" cried the Big Business Man suddenly. Coming down a cross street, marching in orderly array, with its commander in front, was a company of soldier police. It came to a halt almost directly beneath the watchers on the rooftops, and its leader, brandishing his sword after a moment of hesitation, ordered his men to charge the crowd. They did not move at the order, but stood sullenly in their places. Again he ordered them forward, and, as they refused to obey, made a threatening move towards them. In a sudden frenzy, those nearest leaped upon him, and in an instant he lay dead upon the ground, with half a dozen swords run through his body. The men stood in formation, still apathetically watching the events that were going on around them. Meanwhile, the fight on the palace steps raged more furiously than ever. The defenders were reduced now to a mere handful. "A moment more they'll be in," said the doctor breathlessly. Hardly had he spoken when, with a sudden, irresistible rush, the last of the guards were swept away, and the invaders surged through the doorway into the palace. A great cry went up from the crowd in the park as the palace was taken, a cry of applause mingled with awe, for they were a little frightened at what they were seeing. Perhaps 100 people crowded through the doorway into the palace. The others stood outside, on the steps and on the terrace below, waiting. Hardly more than 5 minutes went by when a man appeared on the palace roof. He advanced to the parapet, with several others standing respectfully behind him. "Targo," muttered Oteo. It was Targo triumphantly standing with uplifted arms before the people he was to rule. When the din that was raised at his appearance had subsided a little, he spoke one short sentence, and then he paused. There was a moment of indecision in the crowd before it broke into tumultuous cheers. "The king he killed," Oteo said softly, looking at his master's friends with big, frightened eyes. The Big Business Man stared out over the waving, cheering throng with the huge, dominant, triumphant figure of Targo above, and muttered to himself, "The king is dead. Long live the king!" When he could make himself heard, Targo spoke again. The Doctor and the Big Business Man were leaning over the parapet watching the scene, when suddenly a stone flew up from the crowd beneath and struck the railing within a few feet of where they were standing. They glanced down in surprise and realized, from the faces that were upturned, that they were recognized. A murmur ran over the crowd directly below, and then someone raised a shout. 4 words, it seemed to be, repeated over and over. Gradually the shout spread. Death to the giants! The Big Business Man knew it was. Death to the giants! Until the whole mass of people were calling it rhythmically, drowning out Targo's voice completely. 1,000 faces now stared up at the men on the rooftop, and a rain of stones began falling around them. The Doctor clutched his friend by the arm and pulled him back from the parapet. "They know us. Good God, don't you see?" he said tensely. "Come on. We must get out of this. There'll be trouble." He started across the roof towards the opening that led down into the house. The Big Business Man jerked himself free from the grasp that held him. "I do see," he cried a little wildly. "I do see we've been damned fools. There'll be trouble. You're right. There will be trouble, but it won't be ours. I'm through with this miserable little atom and its swarm of insects." He gripped the Doctor by both shoulders. "My God, Frank, can't you understand? We're men, you and I, men. These creatures," he waved his arm back towards the city, "nothing but insects, infinitesimal, smaller than the smallest thing we ever dreamed of. And we take them seriously. Don't you understand? Seriously. God, man, that's funny, not tragic." He fumbled at the neck of his robe, and tearing it away, brought out a vial of the drugs. "Here," he exclaimed, and offered one of the pellets. "Not too much," warned the Doctor vehemently. "Only touch it to your tongue." Oteo, with pleading eyes, watched them taking the drug, and the Doctor handed him a pellet, showing him how to take it. As they stood together upon the rooftop, clinging to one another, the city dwindled away rapidly beneath them. By the time the drug had ceased to act, there was hardly room for them to stand on the roof, and the house, had it not been built solidly of stone, would have been crushed under their weight. At first they felt a little dizzy, as though they were hanging in mid-air or were in a balloon looking down at the city. Then gradually they seemed to be of normal size again, balancing themselves awkwardly upon a little toy house whose top was hardly bigger than their feet. The park, only a step now beneath the housetop, swarmed with tiny figures less than 2 inches in height. Targo still stood upon the palace roof. They could have reached down and picked him up between thumb and forefinger. The whole city lay within a radius of a few hundred feet around them. When they had stopped increasing in size, they leaped in turn over the palace, landing upon the broad beach of the lake. Then they began walking along it. There was only room for one on the sand, and the other two, for they walked abreast, waded ankle deep in the water. From the little city below them they could hear the hum of a myriad of tiny voices, thin, shrill, and faint. Suddenly the Big Business Man laughed. There was no hysteria in his voice now, just amusement and relief. "And we took that seriously," he said. "Funny, isn't it?" End of chapter 28.